Hello everyone, today we talk about late medieval, if not properly Renaissance mercenaries, but looking in broader terms at the Middle Ages as well in a sort of evolutionary fashion, and more specifically of the areas of origin of European mercenaries and their impact in the scarcely documented but truly very important factually, let's say, coalescence of the European identity throughout properly the Middle Ages, the early modern age. Even if, as we will see, the question is somewhat dark, right? Because we're talking about a business of war that naturally didn't care very much about the broader point that we're making, but that still brought as a consequence to that kind of Western identity as we know. And it's a complex topic in general, also, as always, historically speaking, when trying to define properly the origins of this phenomenon. Because even though now, as I said, we talk mostly about Renaissance warfare, one could start from some point, like the mercenarism of the High Middle Ages, like the 11th century one, including the famous Norman diaspora, that it was factually also of people that were bordering Normandy, as a matter of fact, towards the Byzantine Empire, southern Italy, the Holy Land, and so on. And that had some properly specific characters linked to the structural crisis of the feudal seigneurial lordships and the strengthening of the lineages in the system that basically was letting out this other essentially alienated individuals from the broader games of power would necessarily seek fortune somewhere else. So it's a complex story that we will see somewhere else, but the idea of a movement of people for this military business, and more in general, not even starting from, let's say, not ever ending at any circle point, right? This was very active and intense even in early medieval times. If we have forgotten about that because simply the documentation is pretty scarce for most things, but still we give for granted, in a way, how, let's say, static these systems were without realizing that these practically weren't, that the Middle Ages were actually a moment of great movement of people, of ideas, and they didn't have properly a boundary. That is, our statal, say, contemporary statal asset is a consequence of an entrenchment within a specific territory that derives from, essentially, in fact, the consolidation of power from within same areas, as the intensity of technological capacity, capacity of exploitation in general increased, and also naturally because of international cooperation, but within boundaries that were more functional to this, in fact, larger system, even though some people want to see it in another way. Whereas in high medieval times, the world was open, much more open than today, conceptually, right? And it was normal even for people, again, that lived in appalling material misery compared to us, to simply deem as normal to simply seek fortune somewhere, to be always on the move, and to live essentially like these errant knights also did. And we have, starting from the expansion of Europe in consistent terms in the later centuries, think about the 12th, the 13th, kind of outlet of other, of other scum of the earth. But we made a video about them, the Brabançons, for example, the Écorcheurs, the Armagnac, etc., later on, that were in a certain measure, of course, fallen say, noblemen fallen in misery and moral and behavioral corruption. So this feudal rubbish, if you want, you can't call it, that again was continuing to form because of the gradual centralization of the system that would just close into an oligarchy, leaving the others essentially sinking. And this went on throughout all the Ancien regime. Really, it's not. We've just made a video about French officers' appointment during the 18th century, and we've seen how very often these individuals, at that time, naturally, there was a properly a state and a permanent military where to make a career. But very often, these were the backbone of the army, factually, in terms of competence, of authority, of discipline, of experience. And while the officers were becoming, in a sense, ever more, the higher officers at least were becoming ever more mediated in that process, also in a political rather than military sense, and the bourgeoisie was pushing to oust the nobility altogether, whereas, this petty nobility was actually very active, keeping great part of the system together. In a sense, in medieval times, it was similar because, again, the mercenaries that we've just seen, like the Normans, etc., were also the most successful ones. They were effectively the ones that lived because of hunger and broader ambitions combined. The hottest, let's say, situation, military speaking, that could provide the best element of the armies, and carrying out, in fact, enterprises that remained famous in the Norman epopee and beyond, right? And then naturally were absorbed at some point as soon as they conquered and they kind of gentrified equally and producing other systems, etc. And what happens during properly the creation of the Ancien regime as we intended, that is essentially starting from the 14th century, is the increase also of not just of these figures as a kind of second rank aristocracy that still, however, made the thing militarily speaking, but properly the presence of rank and file troops, right? So properly the scum of the earth gathered from the lower classes that was involved in war, also pretty much for the same reasons, just like for surviving sometimes, because maybe their lifestyle as civilians was even more miserable than the one as military men. It's not they had an easy life as military men at all, right? But it was sometimes there was a higher risk but a higher reward comparatively by a certain degree, and still this was extremely low considering our profit capacities nowadays. And we made multiple videos about this. We made a video about the Spanish rogue, Del Farage. We in a sense, even Roger de Flor video has some of that. We talk about the Brabançon, definitely for mostly medieval stuff, but if you go in the Modern Warfare playlist, you will find other, even from the dialogues of Erasmus of Rotterdam, you find this, the psychophysical wounds of war, and generally speaking, what was the life, the mentality, the horizons of like a 16th century mercenary in a way, and you realize immediately the appalling misery, right? The radical moral and material misery of these individuals that, however, were also the ones that were probably boosted the most by this state of affairs, as war is basically the greatest chaos controllable by man, that basically obliges the spirit to be at the strongest in such nightmare. Therefore, building, and this is the message of this video, let's say building further that moral and scientific awareness of the world through it, right? And if you consider how universal these mercenaries were, well, you realize that they made up, in fact, the bulk of the armies at the time, the ones that would actually carry out the struggle, because the militias normally were, yes, they could be co-opted, but they had a much more limited properly involvement altogether. And the professionals had the lion's share, right? Deservedly so. But how, in this sense, modernity was also built by the experience of this scum that, however, still, brought in its own way a spring, right? Especially from some of the officers, some of these noblemen that really began even from modest conditions initially, in terms of even of properly of wealth. Like, there are examples of some big Montecuccoli, for example, that we made a video on as the milestone in military theory between Machiavelli and von Clausewitz. Well, they began formally, that was an imperial tradition actually, from the final rank pikeman experience, right? Even Prince Eugene, that was, a noble blood, even descending from some distance from the same Habsburgs, as you know, joined the Austrian army essentially without anything, right? Literally, in terms of wealth, eventually he was rewarded because he had connections. But let's say when I stress the idea of the misery, especially the material one, it's the brutal competition that existed also among all of these individuals, for which fighting in a war and as a broader existential philosophy, I would say, connected to tradition and universality and fate and reason at the same time, was the raison d'être, was the only place that these people could have in the world. And naturally it was also a concrete, I'd say a more evidently materialistic comeback, because of course, just we named the most successful here. I think all of those that didn't make it, not just because they were killed, but literally because they at some point they came back home without anything, right? Maybe even poorer than they were before, maybe with some limb less. We made a video about, I don't remember which it was, we were talking about this. I think it was the video about the campaign of Tunis, 1535, speaking of some of the mercenaries. In that case, I think they were German Landsknechten that came back without home, without having probably won anything back from this. So it's this swarm that should deserve, I think, much more attention than the one they're usually credited. Again, not because the mass was anything special, just like in civilian life, but because still these were the cannon fodder, literally, that allowed Western civilization to rise, also in spirit, in intelligence, in rationality, in science, in power, right? True, right? So their sacrifice in this feudal kind of hierarchy is actually very appreciated, retrospectively. But not much their actions per se, nor in fact their kind of ethical basis we'll see now. There were, however, some differences between what was coming to be the leftover, let's say, of the system itself, could produce en masse these individuals, but in a way it was perhaps more internationalized as a system. This would be particularly evident, in fact, together as the other element we're talking about now, but especially from the time, let's say, especially the 18th century, or maybe even the late 17th, when permanent statal armies, right, were essentially coming to dominate the field, right, and where you see lots of people even there that came from other countries, right, and they came so because they were hired ferociously, mercilessly by these recruiters. Say, hired is also kind of a euphemism in that sense. It was a ferocious manhunt, right? You could be in theory, anyone. It could be literally kidnapped and brought forcibly in the army, and not coming out of there alive naturally, but also coming back out of it a different person. I'd say Barry Lyndon from Kubrick is kind of exemplificative of that, in slightly different ways, but not quite, because given that he was Irish, in part, this is the point we're making now, because there were some more, let's say, kind of specifically ethnic pools of recruitment from, let's say, some of the most peripheral areas of Europe, also the least developed in absolute terms, that were falling under the domination of other powers. Speaking still of the British Isles, if you think about the Scottish pikemen that were in late medieval and early modern times, for example, famous mercenaries, right? That pikemen in general were maybe a Scottish feature since the earlier times in the 14th century en masse. They are also protagonists of the great infantry victories of the early 14th century, but later on they, exactly because the same Scottish monarchy by a certain degree kind of strengthened and kind of emarginated some other elements, also from same nobility. Lots of these people participated in other conflicts abroad. I mean, the Scottish presence in Germany during the 30 Years' War, or even, I don't know, in the army of the Swedes, of the Poles and Lithuanians, etc. Looking a bit back in time, also the Welsh archers that everybody that were hired en masse by the English during the 100 Years' War, and everybody saying, the Welsh archers were the best archers ever. That they weren't, right? They were as good as all the others, but there is no evidence that they were anything better or worse than any other archer in Europe. The point is that they were hired en masse from poor countries, and this is the reason why they flocked, one another, either forcibly or voluntarily, in the armies of the greatest powers, and especially the English one at that point was affirming its control on the country, right? And Welsh archers made often the backbone. As we have, just the other day, I was talking about the field strength army of the English during the 100 Years' War, and we've seen that there were, properly ethnic Welsh contingents were considered such because they were hired properly in ways that were probably, in fact, not even very different from the indenture, generally speaking, but there were probably more Welsh troops. But when we look at the mass of the longbowmen in the English indenture, hired by the same English noblemen that eventually contracted with the crown, the service, there would be lots of this foreign elements, calling foreign the Welsh in this case. But there was a specific element, in fact, of these countries, as a specific feature, characteristic, that resided in their still strong clanic and ethnic cohesion, right? The Celtic fringe is a good example because it remained, importantly, kind of, untouched by a great deal of developments that were happening at the time, even in the neighboring England, that, yes, at this time was also a bit cut off from the main continental military developments, so it can be understood, but that still kept living, in a sense, in the way they had always been doing throughout all the Middle Ages, and that for this reason could bring in the fight a form of cohesion that was not to be found in the more kind of not necessarily gentrified, but kind of even simply more modernized and secularized mass of subjects of countries, in fact, like England, France, etc. And that could make up, in part, for the lack of technical development. As we know, moral force is more important. I made a video about the West Highlanders, in that case, it was mostly about the equipment, but we read some passage about their kind of fight, right? And you know that these men these were lords of of castles, of areas where they could also purchase the most updated military equipment. But given the local warfare, that was still kind of inconvenient, right? And they would still go at war with a double-handed sword, chopping each other up as a regular form of fighting in the most terrifying climatic and terrain condition, just because they selected themselves throughout since ever, like in that way, and it was their system, and it worked, right? Because they could compensate again their technical backwardness by a certain degree, at least, with their moral force, right? And the problem there was not the fact that they wouldn't be quick to adopt the same kind of equipment, because again they could. It was a problem of wealth. In part, they couldn't afford it. But again, the point is that their type of warfare was still a clanic one, was still a tribal one, right? So the way they could be integrated in other types of warfare could, let's say, be found out by other powers for very specific roles. Part of them, naturally, they were perfectly capable, in theory, of fighting if provided with the adequate equipment, armament, the modern way. Right, these were men of war. They knew how to arrange, train men, etc. The point, though, is that they would lack that chance, but they had, again, this dramatic moral force that could compensate, in part, with that for that material shortage. The greater problem, naturally, was not just technical. It was that modern armies were developing in a way that naturally showed the magnitudinally large moral superiority of the larger powers over these more backward ones that still couldn't evolve from something more complex than a clan, right? But here we're talking about individual moral strength that again cannot compensate for the collective training that other more modern armies had, but in a sense could make the difference given how balanced odds are still in war in on certain occasions. And you see up to the 18th century what these just the Scotsmen or Irishmen could do, right? Making themselves killed against musketry fire, still launching charges like infantry charges like in medieval times, given that existed also in modern warfare, but it was relatively rare, and passing to cold steel, because that's fundamentally, even a musket was a mirage for many of them, and they needed, the Irish were sent muskets by, by the Pope, so kind of like this, but that could score important victories, even in fact against other opponents. I think about Bamberg, that maybe was the only Irish victory against their English-backed rivals, but the situation was complicated there. And so we know how things ended on the long run. So again, this peoples didn't have much of a shot in general. But it was important to use these troops also from the side properly of the English monarchs, as sending these people abroad, right? And later on in British army how many Scotsmen, how many Irishmen were properly used over the centuries, because the local lands could be freed, therefore, by an opposition provided with solid roots in the land, and therefore capable of organizing a resistance to foreign oppression. So naturally the enlistment of the able-bodied men that were rooted in their own territory, the ones that up to a few generations ago would have been just ferocious warriors, and so attached to their territories and their tradition, was an important advantage for governments in transition towards absolutism, exactly as the leave of the emarginated and of the disadapted, of the alienated, was even in more in fact more gentrified realities. Just yesterday we were talking about 17th century Rome, so in this very kind of libertine style street fights between the retinues of the cardinals, of the ambassadors, of the noblemen. And at the same time, we've seen the masses of the dispossessed that, again, in modern times, for the first time, like beggars, vagrants, etc., were becoming a problem. Right, up to medieval times, it was normal to have beggars around. The local economy absorbed it, etc. In modern era, the growth of cities, of properly urban life, and some kind of pre-industrial activities, etc., would generate ever more kind of in fact, leftovers as part of the the shortcoming of the system, of the pressure of the same, etc. That would become in fact a threat to the same community, and had to be emarginated, segregated. Asylums were created. It was a huge problem for the same veterans, right? That again, maybe would have had a normal life hadn't they been co-opted into war. In fact, I made a video about the French dragonnade exactly at this point, seeing that is not the same thing. We talked, at least in that video, that's what I meant, about the various hotels that were created for the veterans, for the maimed. I mean, just think about all the, in fact, the traumas, not just the physical ones, but the mental ones, coming back after these wars in a community where you don't have basically roots anymore, or many of these people were also criminals properly, but the dragonnades were just another form of abuse, like in that scenario of the confessional clashes in France between the Catholics and the Huguenots. You have Louis XIV that basically billets troops among the Protestant communities, and therefore just making them live off the land, literally, not differently from how they had been habituated, I don't know, in Germany during the 30 Years' War, where they simply looted and killed and raped and whatever. So that was just their default lifestyle, right? And I don't want to make it too dark, but the brutality of that war is beautifully documented, even just by literature. If you've ever read von Grimmelhausen, Simplicissimus, for example, that really opens your eyes about Germany in the first half of the 17th century. I mean, it's one of those stories that you just even ask yourself, how is it possible that such things happen, and eventually, countries moved on in a sense. Maybe the Peace of Westphalia, and that's exactly what I'm talking about here, right? Brought from out of the sheer horror of these wars to create something more regulated, something more orderly, more settled, more permanent, right? And so, paradoxically, it's also this violence that was up to that point unchanneled, because states, again, were growing in parallel. They'd never had such a large amount of troops under their command, etc. So it was a very difficult path, but it helped, even in its negative sides, to boost a reaction, civilizationally speaking. And the type of advantage but coming back to our ethnic, let's say, pools of recruitment, let's say the advantage that could be drawn from the power holders, like the monarchs, could be different, in the sense that the political and military organic resistance from a subjected population, or the turbulence and the crime caused by isolated individuals, but still systemically wide in the broader country, was a problem that needed to be addressed, and that war just put a temporary end to, because again, these people would have come back home, also with military experience, by the way. And this latter aspect, it's in fact what had up to in fact the early modern age also prevented some kind of military developments to happen. Like, for example, France, that unavoidably, however, given its size and power, would essentially pioneer the the political and military developments in the European continent, probably lost the Italian wars to the Spanish because of the recalcitrance of the French nobility to provide itself with an adequate amount of professional infantry, which I also made a video on, of probably the native French infantry of the Italian wars. You know that the French at that point used basically just the Swiss as infantry, and Francis I even tried to recreate some Roman legions with some French levies, etc., but they were just militia and they disbanded quite soon. And the reason being that the nobility didn't want to have veterans, right? Commoners that had been in the wars that might have been disarmed, because at that point they were largely, but in these kind of more advanced countries, but that still could, in theory, procure themselves armor, triggering a revolution, exactly as it had happened over and over during the Jacquerie in the 14th century, as it would happen actually in the same, as a consequence in part of the loss of the war, of the Italian wars, with the French confessional wars that were, a huge chapter of European military history that, strangely enough, nobody talks about. Battles, sieges, it was something enormous. It triggered, in a sense, Louis XIV absolutism, also because of his trauma when he was a child during the Fronde, and the French Revolution later on. So these issues were kind of never solved, right? They were just kind of channels through which the monarchies let vent some dangerous forces. And again, in fact, the most threatening one didn't come from, say, I don't know, for the English, from the Celtic fringe, right? They came from within the same England. Those who had the power and the capacity also, mobilizing something, as look at what the English Revolution brought to with the new model army, right? And literally the boom of military expense when the Parliament finally took over after the Glorious Revolution. So let's say it's which is ironic, because it all started with the ship money. They didn't want to pay anything to the crown for levying troops that were needed for the war against Spain, by the way. So Charles I was actually the best of the stewards. At the end of the century, you have Britain that is taking off as a European power, because finally, I don't know how many tens of times more than the ship money, the Parliament that now had monopolized power was willing to make the country pay. But most of them was also their money. I mean, they were most powerful people as entrepreneurs. So they understood the benefits of war and colonialism. But I mean, that's the point. That's how you evolve. It seems like an eternal contradiction, but it's just a struggle of power at the end of the day. Coming back a little bit to the Middle Ages, anyhow, there were many specialist corps coming from a specific country. This may be a bit of a cliche, but, it's true, and there are reasons for this. For example, in the 14th, 15th century, as we were saying before, there were the Scottish pikemen, quite appreciated, the Welsh archers, the Genoese crossbowmen, and you see here there are these extremes from the poorest to the wealthiest areas of Europe, so that it's not always the case. Like in the 14th century, it's like the infantry victories of the early 14th century. We have victories from the Flemish. They are the richest burghers after the Italians out there. And then you have victories of, I don't know, the Ditmarsha, or even the same Scots that were some of the most depressed people in Europe. And you realize that and there are halfways, kind of like Switzerland, for example, that makes you see that it's not just about wealth. It's not a classist thing. It's not just a materialistic thing. And it depends heavily from a political point of view. Famously enough, and this is the reason being more evident, that entire mercenary, mercenary mounted units were made up by Hungarians, right? Or, we call them Hungarians, but say lightly equipped horsemen specialized in raids coming from a bit everywhere within the same Hungarian realm or beyond, for that matter, even from the same steppes, given that the Pannonian Plain still actually saw some kind of different lifestyle. Some were originally from the ethnic migration of the Magyars. This was, in fact, characteristically a Balkan Danubian cavalry. It was inheriting the steppes culture, and it came from peoples of that were horsemen since birth, from same nomads or from herdsmen, from cattle, breeders, and that were just next door to rich countries like Italy or Germany. Venice, for example, famously enough, drew its horsemen from Dalmatia. The same French king Charles VIII hired during his Italian expedition some Albanians to the same aim. And so when we look at even some terms, I made a video about the various, the hussars, the uhlans, this kind of ethnic specialties that eventually became kind of standard types of troops of Europeans, especially during the 18th century, in the regular armies everywhere. But they had this specific origin because initially in European armies there were these people coming from the steppes and bringing with them this kind of ethnic names. Some were not even properly ethnic. For example, the Stratiots come from the Greek the Stratiotai, which means the soldiers, right? It's a term that you have since Roman time and before, and that were in this kind of post-Byzantine world, like Epirus, like the Albanians, as we've seen, or Ulan, which instead is a Turkish term, actually, which means boy, and it stands for, boy in the sense of servant. It's like the European knecht or things like these, knight servants, etc. That was like the average guy on horseback, right? A lighter trooper, right? Coming, in fact, from the Balkan areas. Balkan is just per se a Turkish word, that still identifies a European land. And so that tells you how blended. We're talking about Bulgarians, Serbians, you name them. All peoples that had been traditionally, Western and heavily Westernized in the late Middle Ages. And that, however, by this comeback of the Ottomans from one side, the Tartars from the other, the extension frontiers toward that eastern direction became hotter, kind of re-Easternized in a sense. I mean, where is the Hungarian Bandarian heavy cavalry? The Transylvanian or Serbian knights dressed, with Milanese armor, right, in these later times. No, they got kind of re-steppized again. Even Poland, that at the end of the Middle Ages was fully Westernized in everything, when it fully, integrated the eastern periphery with Galicia, with Lithuania, etc. It had to re-Easternize in order to cope with the eastern threats, with the Tartars, with the Muscovites, because, and literally engineering what we know as the Polish Hussars, that are basically the most famous probably unit in at least in modern history, and that were Hussars. That was actually a Hungarian term that had been born not even for heavy cavalry but for light cavalry, so that was modified in Poland. So you realize how much influence, cultural connections. There were, Hungarian bodyguards that came at some point from kings of Poland, that came from, say, the Carpathians, because for dynastic reasons had been elected by this like that. So there were French bodyguards at the same time. So it's in others, lots of Germans, other units. So it was a very powerful melange of elements, where you realize, however, that there is a deeply important ethnic rather than statal influence. Right at that point, all monarchies were trying, and I'm glad I made that beautiful series about about the Polish-Lithuanian army. I created a playlist about that. It shows also the differences between the 16th and 17th century, exactly in this evolutionary fashion, that shows the in fact, also the monarchic attempt of centralization, which eventually in Poland would fail. And even the same Sarmatism of the Szlachta was kind of engineered to be anti-statal, anti-public. Whereas in countries like France, you have properly the creation of a state and a permanent army, and something, say, we perceive as more modern, secularized, even in customs, that still, however, lived again in some types of properly of emblems of uniforms later on, and still today, right? That and in many other ways. For example, the same modern military music stems largely even from the instruments, etc., from the Ottomans that had a greater musical tradition in their warfare than that. So this coming back of the steppe is often overlooked in the European world, especially in ancient history, but still to this recently in time, is actually crucial. But there weren't just some, you see, warfare always brings some hybrid, right, between the Ottomans and the Europeans, especially in Central Europe, in Italy. I don't know, German princes exchanged themselves as the greatest gifts, full, Turkish panoplies, right, because they were fascinated with them. That's normal. And so also think about the Serbian haiduks paid by the Venetians or the Habsburgs to carry out guerrilla against the Ottomans. Like, you have this deep continuity, this deep involvement, and I think that the Western world has forgotten exactly that dimension, like the Central European, the Mediterranean one, because it's true, like countries like Britain and France and Spain took off like as states, as also because of colonialism in different ways. But let's say that's what we intend, like even as the peak of achievement of the Western world. But still, there was this other part of Europe, and even something beyond that kind of, let's say, left its mark and impression and still influenced the same traditions in the narrowest Western sense of our military culture. And this happened also from within that same West. For example, areas like the one of the Biscay or Brittany were an important pool of mercenaries, right? They were especially drawn by the English during the 100 Years' War. These were also kind of more savage, like they do belong to the Celtic fringe, like some important connection of the Basques of Brittany and the Celtic fringe in Britain is famous, and were more depressed areas, and they would think about the Bidots that came from these areas like Navarre. There was the Bread and Company in Italy during the 14th century of Fra Moriale, as it was called. So it's like, you see, it's like a bit the barbarian invasion. Like you have, if you look at Europe and you look at these mercenary movements, they're not dramatically different from the ones that happened during the migration era, right? Or the ones that had been happening a bit with that mechanism of the one coming from the poorest, depressed areas that search for fortune, even risking life, that the guy living in more developed areas in the flatland that can actually pay these guys for fighting on their behalf can avoid of doing, right? And so these fluxes are very, very meaningful because they made Europe in itself, and they shared and they blended it, and they made it unique in their own way, in a terrible way, of course. So it's fair to say that it was the poor, impervious, and peripheral Europe, the one of the bitter and or ungrateful, desertic, and mountainous areas, to provide the mercenaries. Instead, in the most prosperous areas, the rustics and the urban populations had been essentially disarmed historically, sometimes from a very long time, by their sovereigns, and subjected to the logic of essentially of production managed by the bourgeoisie that was still emerging as an elite intermediately between the aristocracy and the commoners, right? And gaining power, and kind of, as you know how it ended in the 18th and the 19th century. But it's in the Middle Ages that you can see the roots of, say, of descent stemming from the same veterans, from these same mercenaries. For example, in the 15th century, after the defeat of the Taborites, that is the intransigence of the Bohemian Hussite movement, many of them dispersed as they were scattered in Germany and in Poland as mercenaries still. So bringing with them in those lands their courage and their military originality, let's say, but perhaps also that seed of a religious creed that, surprise, surprise, a few decades later would have turned into the Reformation. So rather than, again, the technical side of the story, because I made several videos at this point on Hussite warfare, and you know what my opinion is, that that it was the fruit of a very specific context. If the wagon force had reached France or Italy, artillery would have made things going in a very different way from what happened against the Hungarian knights in Central Europe. And given, because everything depends on the specific on the specific context, but even in there, it was a matter essentially of moral force, right? Wagenburgs were existing since ever. The Hussites didn't invent anything, right? What made their victories was moral force, as always. They knew how to exploit this system. Historians also elaborated a bit like that. If you know the accounts of Enea Silvio Piccolomini about this terrible, that what we saw as heretics, right? And so as Satanists, essentially, this Wagenburgen that would have turned like incredible maneuvers, enveloping, doing, probably wasn't anything like that. It was just very hard, stubborn, sturdy resistance, exploiting these means, but actually just adapting to a situation. And those were also, in fact, areas surely not characterized by particular wealth, that especially same Hussite wars contributed basically to make disappear. Like Bohemia crumbled, like lost 1/3 of its population by the 15th century. It kind of went back to the Stone Age because of that. So these are actually not even just positive things, just like the Reformation, retrospectively in a European traditional and universal sense, was not a positive thing, right? This doesn't depend much on what the Catholic Church had become at that point. That has to do with the incapacity of keeping the system together from both sides, right? So it speaks of the world aging, and so naturally it's definitely too far-fetched to attribute to the Taborite military experience just the seeds of the Reformation in a kind of a structural way. But at the same time, we don't know. That is to say, especially from those areas in Central Europe, very often we don't have, we're grossly underdocumented. We don't know especially what these individual people thought or said, or or really had in mind, which instead, as we know, moral forces are really the thing, not just in war, but in anything, right? And ideas can be quite contagious, they can spread very far, and they can be quite convincing if they have passed through the very harsh test of something like, the Hussite wars, and again, in terms of, human necessity and ways to find a way out, and had definitely sharpened the realization about the world and reality, and it was a brutal thing, but at the same time provided in part for that kind of stoic resistance that the Hussites themselves, especially the Taborites, displayed. So by the end of the Middle Ages, some chthonic beliefs connected to what you would speak in those terms mostly as wizard-like ideas, but the situation is a bit more complicated than that. You would argue it was paganism still, but paganism is a very generic and unspecific terms. So just say that the Scottish Highlands, even the Meseta Highlands, and certain valleys in the Alpine arc were retaining beliefs and cults and ideas that were, quite heterodox to say the least from a Christian point of view, not just probably from a Catholic point of view. And it's possible that, a certain coming back even of, in fact, the interest towards pagan practices, the occultism that you find among this was the time of humanism that was recovering the classics, etc. But you see that there is more there. There is something more chthonic, more subterranean, more kind of a subcultural humans that came back. And given that, especially in the second half of the 15th century, they spread all over the continent, make us suspect that those areas of primitive spread were the same ones from which many mercenary soldiers came. And this is relevant because I don't know how much historiography has been produced, let's say, on these topics, and also this is a quite late time in which the original universal tradition was properly, was present, but at levels that were probably not really, of which these peoples were not really the depositaries of, because they were kind of much more mixed with the chthonic element. Like the Uranic element was surely dominated by the church. There are, and by those who gravitated around it. We know it, that also during the Reformation, and with important authors that speak about this refer to a sort of esoteric initiation to these ideas, and so they definitely belong to much more developed environments that had somewhat preserved or recovered in many ways this knowledge, and making it complete thanks to classical philology, by the way, right, with Latin, Greek, etc. So but the taste for it, like, let's say, the awareness of such beliefs could have also been further, let's say, stimulated by the, let's say, the cultural heritage of these communities, especially, again, scattered in areas that were, yes, formerly Christian, but you can just imagine how these people lived, right? It's not very strange to say that, I don't know, even in certain area of Germany, like, speaking of Christianization, even up to the early modern age, was a bit, optimistic, considering properly the mental isolation of these communities that, in fact, were mostly literally isolated. I mean, people living in the forest or completely cut from anything, right? And this is typical of basically all the Central, Eastern, Northern Europe, right? That probably had been untouched, and they had, however, just for this reason, mastered something that the European tradition had taught religiously only instead in the most advanced countries, in the ones that had taken over the world through the imperial ideology. And so it's very difficult to make a historical assessment about the properly, even the at this point, the organic functionality of those religions. Some of them, these people were illiterate. They didn't even, you can imagine how the oral tradition had changed all this, considering that still, yes, they lived in isolated places, but again, as mercenaries, they did travel the world, so they knew how it was. And we know this from anthropology even today, that there are certain communities that have memory of their own pagan past, like in places like the Americas or Asia, whatever, that even, were Christianized since the Spanish arrived, things like this, but they still kept memory of things that, however, they don't quite understand anymore. Like, they just know the story that we, having studied, history of religion can reconstruct and that they have no idea of, but that they still keep repeating and that are disappearing because they don't even understand how important it is historically, right? Just live with it. And they even served, again, abroad. They were hired, they were sent overseas fighting, etc. They came back home, however, and that was their world, remained isolated and kept on harboring those ideas and gradually also diluting them at the point that they will be forgotten before, unfortunately, anthropologists will be able to document this. I've met with people who make this form of type of research, and it's like it's heartbreaking, frankly, and unfortunately, like say, the worst is that we're not even understanding that the problem is we should revive religion in order to understand how important it is. Ethnoanthropologically, scientifically, morally. Of course, these things go lost because nobody today would teach these people religion, right? And the proof that Christianity didn't actually remove these ideas is that they are still there, especially in the areas that remain the more primitive and still accepting Christianity basically right away, because that's the history of more primitive cultures, that they don't have basically any reason to resist that, right? So unfortunately we have been engineered this kind of modernistic, secularistic, progressistic, atheistic, let's be honest about this, superstition that basically make us read the world upside down or not at all, and that has caused the greatest disasters that no other thing in history basically ever produced. In any case, there is surely room for research, paradoxically, about even medieval Europe, late medieval Europe, especially the early modern age, regarding these ideas that are surely documentable quite easily. And so what I'm saying here is that aside from the International of Kings that was maintained at that point through the game of parentage that was essentially splitting Europe in states and preparing to the Iron Century of the 17th. So, and also later the age of nationalisms, right, that were disrupting universal tradition. And next to the International of the Noblemen that still recognized themselves in the courts, in the tournaments, in carousels, and still probably were the ones that had a kind of a closer understanding of the older values, of the older tradition. It was also this humble, I mean, in a more systemic way, there was also this humble international of mercenaries that, even though imperfectly, as we've seen, was probably maintaining part of the old continental identity, especially the most brutal and violent and completely, devoid of any human mercy kind of one, and in an incredibly primitive-minded form, part at least of those ancient cults and beliefs, etc., that could complete the bottom of this hierarchy that we have traced, that after all was still displaying importantly, even among, in the monarchies that were accelerating, yes, the process of statalization and secularization, but still, the older ideals of the warrior, of glory, of things that were being transmutated in part, but only very gradually, right? And in fact, we will never fully know, unfortunately, which weight, at least to which point, how much weight the just speeches of soldiers in front of fireplaces of the bivouac in the evening, in the religious and spiritual history of Europe, right? The exchange of experiences regarding faraway countries, the comparison of their usages, their customs, their traditions, of their beliefs, of their respective creeds. But such weight must have been enormous, immense, right? And we have forgotten it. So just imagine it. I mean, just like as a Scot going to fight, I don't know, in Poland, during the 17th century. Can you imagine what 17th century Scotland was like? I mean, seriously. And what also 17th century Poland was like. And not just in terms of difference, but in terms of, how, especially the peasantry would be somewhat alien to other cultures. I mean, the European aristocracy had always been international, just by universal creed, and that was the point. Whereas the Teutonic masses had always kind of dwelled much more into their local abodes, and that's why the terrible plague of national socialism from the statalistic, collectivistic, Fourth Estaters, the generations of the revolutions brought in all this completely alienated and blissful mentality coming from the lowest, from literally from the scum of the earth, right? Of the earth. I care to stress the earth because that's what their chthonic beliefs were connected to historically, differently from the Apollonian Uranic one of the empire, right? But you see, even in the traditional universal belief, you needed the substance of these people to be framed within the form of the hierarchy to carry out wars. The modern age was the moment in which everything was locked, like since the 14th century, the ancien regime brought the lower classes down, imposed their control on them, and simply used them as cannon fodder, again, all over the world eventually. And without them, we could have not had modernity, right? At least in the positive element of it. We could have had the Western domination over the world. We could have not had essentially the achievements through which essentially the entire globe today has elevated itself. And of course, the elite pioneered this all through its beliefs, through its values. But the humble mercenary, and we will see what we're capable of doing just on a regular basis, we just hinted at it, would still bring his own tiny but still necessary element, right, all together. I made a video last autumn about the poor and fierce Swiss mountaineers that, starting from the 15th century, found an economic vent destined to last for a long time in mercenary recruitment. You know that in the 14th century, the Swiss essentially earned their independence, which sounds a bit teleological because they were just yet another German Landfried that eventually lasted to was not necessarily meant to last, right? Paradoxically, if the Swiss had not been butchered at Marignano, maybe Switzerland today would not exist even. So it was even a luck for them to get out of the main scene like that. But still, right, by the 14th century, we're just dwelling in their own abodes, right? It's in the 14th century in the 15th century that they, as you know, through the professionalism imposed by the cantons in creating these massive pike squares, they functionalized their entire nation in mercenary service, right? This would eventually also escape the control of the Confederacy by a certain degree. Lots of Swiss went abroad independently. They were forbidden, right? This is very common. For example, the same was in Genoa. In Genoa, as you know, they provided this enormous amount of fleets to the Main, to France, to England, to Castile, the famed crossbowmen. But there were specific laws that we have that said that they couldn't do it alone, right? Everything was very strictly regulated. So initially it was the same for Switzerland, except this was an entire country and also a pretty populated one that could afford even just to have such large amount of pikemen as part of and also the resources for training them to that specific end, right? Differently from basically any other country in Europe that eventually had to adopt the Swiss model, but only if it was, in fact, to make, in relative terms, a much less intensive use of its own population, right? And this is the point about the Swiss that we were highlighting at the time, that within the panorama of European history, they are a phenomenon rich in contradictions and even of ironies. For example, in Switzerland, they had essentially been the most like the greatest enemies, properly, of the feudal system that they crashed at Morgarten, Laupen, etc., against the Habsburgs that were still coming there in heavy cavalry, barded horses, full armor, full at least at that point, not quite because we were still in the mid 14th century, I mean full panoply, let's put it in this way, and being butchered by these, again, mountaineers with their halberds, etc., but through ambushes mostly. This initial, capacity of the Swiss of taking by surprise before the enemy had even deployed for battle. So, actually, in the 14th century, more because of that than of actual tactical capacity, that instead by the mid 15th century would make them skyrocket to the heights of European warfare. Whereas between the 14th and 15th century, their same military presence saved the historical legacy of the same feudal system. Because jealous of their own borders and of the traditions and of the liberties that they characterized them, the Swiss would serve, outside of those same boundaries, the most despotic among the feudal governments, de facto, chiefly France, right? So the peak of the feudal, that was becoming now stattal tradition, exactly because it had evolved to a more complex system. So that the French armies had Swiss infantry, and practically only that. Even though, yes, of course, it was some native infantry, but as we've seen, they weren't. And the advantage, by the way, it's what we were saying before. The French would hire the Swiss not to have native infantry that could become radicalized as veterans who could pick up arms against the noblemen, because the Swiss came back home when they were done, right? They hadn't to be reintegrated in the French community at all, right? And also the Swiss way of war, right, in this massive formations and their typical weapon, the pike, that actually, it was the Vosges initially and the halberd, but the pike itself was not much a technological feat, right? The pike exists since prehistory. It's the collective use made of the pike, right? Through those immense resources you could master and the very intense training that up to that point no medieval infantry had ever had, were in fact still very primitive. We've seen that even, fencing, the individual pikeman it took a lot of training to remain in formation, but in that mass, there wasn't much ability required in fencing, in having a precise surgical hit. They just had to go en masse rapidly, right? Advancing, maintaining the formation, and then pushing like hell. Just knowing how to keep that pike straight, avoiding swings, and that's brutal force rather than actual finesse of any sort, right? But exactly because of that, because collectively speaking, they were that orderly, and individually they were just not much. And that's how, in fact, modernity would go towards, even in the military, right? It's not that at Culloden Moor, a redcoat musketeer was kind of individually a better hand-to-hand fighter than a Highlander, right? But how it ended, and how it ended, not just to those who were slaughtered by the English on the field, but also the massacres that were carried out across rebel Scotland later on. So here we're talking about the plain destruction of that model, right? So of that culture, that, you know, modest civilizational development. It's it's what made the thing, right? The Swiss themselves kind of say, you can't say revolution the military techniques of the time, but they definitely boosted the development of the art of war in Europe dramatically, right? And in appearance, it may seem a contradiction, but in reality, it's deeply coherent. The Swiss way of war, with valor and dedication, was evident up to the moment in which they were regularly paid, right? And this is very famous also among the free companies, soldiers of fortune in the previous centuries. And actually even worse, because the Swiss were even less serious than them. Like the free companies very often were much more kind of, you know, chivalric in the way they happened. The Swiss would simply abandon immediately the field in the very moment the pay began to run short. They didn't give a damn about anything. They were just in for the money. So, in fact, the French said, "Pas d'argent, pas de Suisse," right? Which is quite eloquent. So, seriousness, punctuality, professional inflexibility, on which an entire modern people seems to have placed the basis of its own proverbial future prosperity, derived from this functionality, right? They say, you know, we are out there to cash, to make money. We don't make money, we come back to Switzerland, right? So that's the Swiss spirit in a nutshell. And in turn, according to the Swiss model, in the early 16th century, the Swabians recruited by Maximilian of Habsburg, that were in line of principle some just free peasants, were organized, right? Germany had seen like these leagues emerging, like at the end of the late Middle Ages. We've seen it in other videos, including the Swiss Confederacy was essentially the same thing, but it was the Swabian League, it was the Rhineland League. And interestingly enough, the Habsburgs go to hire troops, actually, like mostly in places like Westphalia, eventually, they were not Austria, right? A bit for the same reason why the French would use the Swiss, right? And again, these were just anyone, like whoever you could enlist, that would receive this minimal pay at that point. But it's from here that the German Landsknechte would have become a constant presence on the battlefields of all of Europe, right? So that even though created properly as the name says to serve the land, eventually they would be hired everywhere, right? How many, I don't know, German mercenaries existed even before that, like in the War of the Roses, we found them. It was just this system expanding, and these people being available on the market in a moment actually of great upheaval, because Europe was about to disintegrate because of the Reformation, and so all the wars that characterized the modernity kind of began even properly in this initial disorder, in this initial break, right? That would make wars also ever less circumscribed, or at least properly capable of drawing people from everywhere, unlike it had ever happened before, exactly because of this viability and the increasing destructive capacities of the statal armies that we're creating. So a lot of people that would come together with them. You know that up to the 18th century, the model here is just like in the Middle Ages, because it had started in the late medieval times. Mercenaries paid for a while, and then militias, right? And gradually, only from at some point, very small statal contingents that grow increasingly large, and relevantly so only from the second half of the 17th century onwards. So think about just the competition and the all-in kind of mentality. I mean, the 30 Years' War, of course it was the plague, etc., but it wiped out 1/3 of the entire German population. Because, like, all Europe went to pillage and raid and destroy there, including the Germans themselves. So, this is the dramatic picture that we have to draw about the mercenaries. Of course, that it's not there's the romantic myth that the mercenary is less reliable than the home national. It has nothing to do with that. They would for pay, they would do exactly the same thing. Actually, mercenaries were more reliable because they knew how to fight, and if you paid them, they would stick to you. Militias were incapable, unreliable, right? And how do you want that to happen? It was normal, right? The disarmament, after all, to the purpose of sterile control over a certain population that uses mostly professionals. Again, it's something that started since very early time, right? The same feudal system had never fully. When did militias ever served all together? It was always a selection that would increase the let's say it would actually diminish the amount of people who would regularly be employed in combat in a campaign, actually, because that was the main problem, staying a long time out there in arms, right, with somebody at the end of the day paying for you, because the myth of people going there with their own backpack, their own resources required by the state never happened in any historical time, right? It was always the state paying for them, right? For good piece of those who think that the Marian reforms invented that for the Romans, while it was just a state of things from centuries. In any case, this is the point, that aside from the undebatable advantages that the mercenaries would provide with, also their faults, their problems emerged, right? Again, this was mostly also a statal problem. Like, if you hire a lot of people, you tell them, who will pay you, and you give them arms, and you make them fight, and then at some point you stop paying them. Like, it's kind of obvious that if you couldn't afford that, these people will say, okay, we want our money. And if you don't give them, it will start pillaging all around, right? So you can't hope to go pillage those places that are the enemy ones, right? So, or the ones of your political rivals or things like these. But most cases, who can stop these forces? Like, at the time, if you have thousands of professionals in arms that start being hungry and you don't pay, you don't have much else to stop them. There are not tanks, helicopters, nuclear weapons. These people are basically ruling the land on their own. As you know, Machiavelli was a bit the most famous author to kind of put the mercenaries under a negative light, to reinforce this prejudice that, of course, mercenaries were violent, like pretty much everyone at the time, and especially given that they were armed and they knew how to fight, and they needed to be paid, and they were there for that reason. And it's considering Machiavelli's extraordinary fortune and the consequent circulation of his work in Europe, right? Kind of everybody at the time started watching over the mercenaries with that kind of, worry, right? There was another work that was echoing Machiavelli, written in the mid-16th century by Raymond de Fourquevaux, that in his Instructions sur le fait de la guerre, dating 1548, underlined how the mercenaries didn't fight pro aris et focis, which is a Latin expression to fight for your altar and fireplace, so for your religion and family, but only in view of the gain and of the loot, of war, the booty of war. And this work describes essentially how the mercenaries were disbanded when, only loaded in riches, and even after having waited with due time, right, taken the due time to loot further, leaving to the they would go away essentially by leaving to the national militias, let's call it in this way, which is kind of partly anti-historic, the truly dangerous tasks. And therefore how the mercenaries in this proved their advantaged position. Because they definitely held the knife from the side of the hilt, and they were the unstoppable force. If you wanted to make war, you had to rely on them. They had to rely on you, because their job was not easy, right? None of this was an easy way to make money for non-involved, right? Except, of course, if you were the leader. I mean, if you think about how rich Wallenstein was and could even take over Germany entirely. But first of all, we know how he ended as well. I made a video about him. But at the same time, it's still all uncertain. You have to win that on the battlefield. It's extremely costly, and if you want to make business out of that as an officer, you will just proportionally decrease the effectiveness of your unit. So we made videos. The first ones I was talking about at the beginning of the video is exactly what we already discussed. And in fact, this broader idea, let's say, on the mercenaries is, again, because the elite spoke about them, but the frame in this sense is not objective, and it has tendentious elements that, however, on the other side, were absolutely not far from the truth, right? Just to make an example, the Landsknechte that in 1529 had freed Vienna from the famous first Ottoman siege had immediately demanded, actually pretended, a triple pay, threatening, if they had not been satisfied, that they would have sacked Vienna herself. Right, so, this is also for, eliminating romantic visions, etc. The great noble task of this man provided with the deeply great, European values. No, as always, only the hierarchy actually saw it better in the way. These people were essentially going to do the same thing that the Turks would have done to the Viennese if they hadn't been paid. So the problem was that, again, there was practically no attachment from the mercenary side to the governments that they served. They didn't give a damn, right? There was some feeling, of course, if you would have had to pillage your own village, maybe you would have said something else. But let's say we have to make the effort in asking ourselves, what was the actual identity at the time? Because it was, the idea of modern national identity at this point was quite tenuous, right? There was a general understanding, yes, there were the Germans, the French, the Spaniards, and all these things, but let's say overall, right, people from a village to a village, from house to house, they hated each other guts. There was a much more properly sense of, status divide than national belonging. Right, look at how, the Polish Szlachta treated the Polish peasants like subhumans. They didn't give a damn about them. They were noblemen. That's the only thing that counted. And in perspective, even for the welfare of the state, that didn't manage to centralize and was partitioned later on, exactly because of this abstractionism from the side of the nobility. This sense, maybe the common folk had a greater idea maybe of the need of a greater power at the top, like a ever more centralized one, because frankly this was the narrative always, right? Unfortunately the again classistic, leftistic, etc. reading of history has told us that absolutism was about the terrible kings eating brioche and not giving a damn about the people. These were the people who had actually managed to reduce the abuses of the nobility and to actually make these entire states expanding massively, actually through the bourgeoisie. So of course they didn't give a damn about the peasants, but they actually did, because without them they couldn't have a prosper economy in the first place. So you can't squeeze them more than much, because otherwise they wouldn't even work properly. So for those time standards, and so the whole thing is complex and worth consideration in general. And I think that there is a lot of at least thought-provoking ideas that you can put in the fray here. And there is always like a positive and negative side, which doesn't absolutely have anything to do with making moral relativism, well, but this, well, but that. No, there was an order here that still existed and that still made the difference. And everything has to be evaluated in the broader, again, political direction, which when studying history, as we're habituated to do now, in a kind of a sociological sense, again, by mostly Marxist influence, we just tend to look actually the other way, because we look at this mostly horizontal segmentations, while we don't consider the vertical ones that were actually the most important. So that even greater divides were not caused by the let's say a specific class identity or even national identity or whatever, but it was caused by who actually could have power, and the masses paradoxically could have power. I mean, the same mercenaries, after all, were an expression of this almost revolutionary element, but still were under the great rulers of the time. Here you don't have any subversion like a proletarian revolution of the mercenaries. Here you can't have it, right? The ancien regime could have this because it was led by the elite. That, however, was the elite also of a system that was in part fragmenting but still expanding, and so therefore this kind of losses of control were obvious, because in such an unstable system you can't not even pretend to afford, without it having truly ever historically existed, a compact state of what would arrive to the 19th century. In fact, even at that point, when you have the nation state as we know it, of course the worst was brought, but not because of the thing in itself, but because the ideas that were motivating them largely were wrong. And so you can have, and eventually the system adjusted, because even the French Revolution eventually had Napoleon later, so everything rebalances from the extremes and tends towards the improvement. The problem is when, again, the ideas actually not even just per se wrong, but they deplete themselves, when there is no strength to push forward, where there's forgetfulness about what is that makes the thing happen successfully, positively. And without direct experience and command, it's very difficult to achieve that, because you don't know how it works in reality. So that's the mistake that we often do when we study history. We want to learn history, and that in general makes you, in fact, much more sensitive to the importance of the decision, to the importance of the judgment of a specific situation, and who is in charge and what responsibilities person has, what's her own background, and so how things eventually are made, right, with all the difficulties or the mistakes, etc., but still, right. In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.